Um, Guys in the audience, if you can hear me, let me know. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay. This is episode, I don't remember, 86, I think, of Axioms on Trial. I am broadcasting right now from a different location than usual. I'm still in Georgia. I attended the National Atheist Convention, and I'm probably still going to be here for about another week and a half. Jeremiah, unfortunately, won't be able to join us tonight, but he'll be back next time. And we'll go over what that experience was like, meeting in person, and what building community was like, and what the actual conference was like. It was great, and I'm really glad that I attended, made a lot of really great connections and new friends, and was really grateful for the opportunity. But so for today's episode, I want to bring in a philosophy educator. We're going to talk about what led her to believe what she believes, what she thinks that the value of philosophy is, and we're going to be talking about different platforms like TikTok versus YouTube and a bunch of different things. So I'm going to bring her on. There we go. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. First of all, thank you so much for deciding to do this and coming on tonight. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
So, give us a little bit about your background, like what it is that you do, and what your interests are.
Sorry, okay, you broke up a little at the end there, but just okay. So, my background, my undergraduate degree is philosophy and psychology. My interests, though, have always, I did like Lincoln Douglas debate when I was even in high school. So, my interests kind of have always been value systems, if you will. And then after undergraduate, before I had the opportunity to do graduate school, I was actually a preschool teacher for a period of time, and I did a number of like early childhood development courses. So all of these things kind of came together. And when I did move out to the Midwest to pursue my PhD in philosophy, which I never thought would have been an opportunity, it, all of those background interests fed into that. And my main kind of primary, I guess you would say, area of specialization in the field of philosophy is now philosophy of mind, with an interest towards mental health and how we understand theory of mind across different experiences, as well as kind of like larger metaphysical views or on like ontology in general. Um, I would say, like, so that's kind of how I would summarize, if that's a good way of introducing
Yeah,
my
absolutely.
specific philosophy interests.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I guess that's a good place to start. I guess what is your position as far as philosophy of mind, if you have one? What are yeah, what we can have a back and forth as far as what it is that we agree or disagree with in that context.
So, okay, I would say philosophy of mind, the best way for me to introduce my very unique view. Okay, so if you think about certain experiences, certain mental health experiences, you might think, for example, we always think about the really popular ones, I think, for mind body connections. Like you might think like fission cases would be how we might summarize, like, okay, what would happen in fission cases. Split brain patient cases are kind of popular for that discussion as well, for the relationship between mind and body. But I think an even more interesting case would be the dissociative spectrum, like disorders in general. And I always include borderline personality disorder in that grouping, or like CPTSD, for example. But dissociative identity disorder would be the predominant one. And if anybody keeps up with Marvel and like those movies, Moon Knight, which I always accidentally call Moon Snail, Um, Moon Knight, he has dissociative identity disorder. So for me, my theory of mind or my philosophy of mind view is kind of informed by trying to make sense of cases that we have of mind right now. And I would say, as much as I most definitely am a believer of the natural sciences, sometimes I can't tell if physicalism is meant to include the psychological sciences or the social sciences or the political sciences as counting, amongst, physical objects. So I think what I want to propose, if you're following me, is I am definitely like a realist about things like social environments, social pressures, social causes. And I think mind and self and subjectivity, those types of things might be dependent upon a very real, social ontology, or like social level to our ontology that I don't necessarily think needs to be property dualism, and that doesn't have to take us in any way, shape, or form away from monism. Like, I'm most definitely a monist about the world, but that essentially the analogy I would want to introduce is when you're thinking about an object like a chair or like the candle and the wax, they always just talk about the form and the candle and the wax, but think about the fact that there are atoms as well. And, there are many atoms, arguably distinct atoms, material objects that are distinct from each other and in relation with other objects. But to us, phenomenologically, you zoom out because you can experience, like if you look through a microscope, the atoms, but you see the bigger object. So then I am wondering if, without breaking our monism, we can then also think and abstract to a social environment and think that those are real, like physical properties, but we just right now don't have the language, So that's a very long-winded
Sure.
explanation of what I would say is my philosophy of mind.
Yeah, thank you so much I want to say a couple things, and one, it's actually interesting
Absolutely, yes.
you bring up DID, or dissociative identity disorder, because I actually have a certain level of dissociative issues. Not as far as like an actual identity disorder, because I think that's going way too far the other spectrum. But I definitely have a lot of experience with kind of derealization, feeling like the experiences that I'm having are kind of almost like dreamlike,
Yep.
and having a dissociative experience for my own self, but not in the sense of other identities, but just as a kind of an overall general feeling of kind of a detachment, not emotionally, but psychologically,
Yeah.
from my own identity in some sense. And that used to be something that really weighed me down when I was younger, like really scared me. And I've actually learned to kind of look at it as a positive in a sense,
Yeah.
because I think it's helped me look at the world from a perspective that I wouldn't otherwise have. Like you're talking about just now. For those that don't know, monism is essentially the idea that everything is one substance, right? Like that there is kind of one fundamental. What's the word I'm looking for? Well, how would you define it? How would you define monism?
That's how I think of it. One substance that fundamentally, at like when you dig down to the very root of like the very basics of what you need to build your ontological view, there's going to be one type of thing in its simplest
Right.
form.
And so, yeah, so I'm with you on that on that idea. I do think that there are certain categories of mind that seem to emerge that may say more about the way in which our mind compartmentalize our reality rather than what is actually fundamentally there. And so, like, I think kind of what you were saying before, like, you while you might, like, it sounded like you were saying that you think some of these categories, whether they're social categories or psychological categories, are real in the same way that we might say certain objects are real. And I'm not sure where I stand on that. Like, I think that I'm starting to wonder how much of how we think about our reality is more what we observe kind of like emergent features as opposed to actually being fundamental ones. If that makes sense. And yeah, so I just wanted to kind of point to that because I think that is an interesting view that you have.
Yeah, so because I would say the best way to talk about what the influences for my view might be, like I'm very much a Spinozian, I think I would say. I also have a lot of Kantian influence, but I very much lean in my view, like ontologically, I feel very comfortable with saying, there's one type of stuff probably in the most simple way that we could look at ontology. But if you look at the human experience, for example, the human experience seems to very much be, at the very least, and again, you could maybe say it's going to get complicated really fast, but there does seem to be a physical or maybe you want to say an external, without bringing too much epistemology in, an external, component to our phenomenology, a component that we don't really have any control over. But then there's a component of our phenomenology that we do have some type of control over, arguably, at least from our point of view, and that those seem to be, like, philosophically interestingly different. Now, in terms of natural science, I would agree. I don't necessarily, and again, natural science excluding the psychological sciences, I don't necessarily think that type of thing becomes relevant. But the psychological sciences, I think it is relevant for those psychological science. And then I think what I want to argue is that what psychology studies is real,
sure,
in the philosophically relevant way that the things that biology studies is real.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I would hope that one day, like, I'm sure you've heard about the idea of, a theory of everything. I hope that maybe one day these apparent gaps between the sciences can be bridged more so than they are currently. I think the question of what is real can become a little bit hazy at times, especially when we're talking about psychology, because obviously the experiences that any of us have are real experiences. But whether or not they're pointing to something externally real, or real in purely our I say mental, but our mental experience, I think it becomes the question. I think that line can get blurred a little bit. But I do think that psychology is, definitely a valuable field that I hope will be, will continue to grow as time goes by.
Well, here, and this is kind of a good segue for future. We don't have to segue directly into it now, but I will say, so for me, and like my when I do the work that I do on TikTok, for example, one of the ways that I then bring that back into like my philosophy experiences is things like things that might be left out of historical philosophical discussions would be the way in which like race plays an important causal role in certain things, not only in terms of phenomenologically, but then also in terms of objective reality. And I think that that's something that that's in the interest of trying to bring some of those discussions to the table, I've noticed that, like you have to kind of start to move towards that direction of that we don't have, that the answer we have right now isn't sufficient at the very least, if that makes sense.
Yeah, maybe could you provide some examples? Like, what have you learned as a TikToker that's kind of influenced the way that you look at these things and informed your approach to these topics?
Okay, so one of the things, first I'll have to say, and this isn't directly TikTok related, but I really bring in my mental health diagnoses. I know not everybody likes to put their mental health diagnoses at the forefront, but for me, because of the area of philosophy that I do, I think it's really relevant and it informs a lot of what I think and what I believe. So one of my diagnoses is like a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, and that comes with a lot of this dissociation, a lot of like split view or fragmented experiences of selfhood, and trying to make sense of what's going on with that. Now, when I started my TikTok experience, that was where I was coming from, trying to make better sense of that, trying to find people who had a similar experience to me. And what I found very quickly is I made a number of mistakes along the way that are like my responsibility, my mistakes, as I was initially navigating. And I'm only laughing because I look back on it and just think about, you just look back and you're like, oh, you little naive self. Oh, it would have been great if we had thought a little bit more before we had gone. But I do tend to be, I'm going to act first and think about it after the fact. And there are consequences to that you must face. So
Sure.
in navigating the TikTok space, one of the things that I would do is I would follow all types of creators, and I would navigate in the spaces of those creators equally, because that was my view. My philosophical view was, ethically, we all treat each other equally. That's like kumbaya. Here we are. Like, it doesn't that's what we do. Not really realizing the way that perspective is informed by my experience as a white, feminine individual, like a woman passing individual. And the way that, as much as maybe growing up, that experience informed a lot of like my trauma and my sense of self, and how I, issues that I might have, that I might feel oppressed. Coming to terms with, okay, yeah, but think about other individuals' experiences, how you objectively, not phenomenologically, objectively being the race that you are, being white, there's going to be different social impact when you say certain things or when you do certain things than if you were Black or if you were Indigenous, for example. So that's kind of, to me, one of the examples where it's really hard to say that you can't just reduce the discussion right off the bat. In order to kind of think about the impact of the discussion, you're thinking, okay, like objectively, like physically, there are these traits that are going on, and there are these psychological traits at play. And for the philosopher, taking that step back and kind of realizing, oh, okay, look at the impact on my ontological view. That's kind of one example that I would say. I don't know if that is making sense.
Yeah,
The way
yeah. No, I think I'm following. I think you're saying that being aware of the ways in which our, social identities play out in the way that we experience the world, and how the way in which we navigate this dialogue is going to have different implications and different effects to different people, and who it is that we're engaging with. And yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think as long as one learns from those mistakes, that you mentioned when you first started TikTok, what matters is growth, and figuring out where one went wrong, and kind of trying to resolve those mistakes. I think one thing that concerns me in the way in which today's culture uh, seems to operate is that a lot of that space for learning kind of is shut down. It seems to me that um, the second that one says something that's not uh, taken well, immediately everybody's, I think, given the label of bigot or racist or sexist. And I am concerned sometimes with the ease with which those labels are kind of thrown around. I do think that they apply to a lot of people, and I think a lot of people, especially from um, there's a lot of people who are not aware of their own white privilege, and I think that's something that we have to spread education in that context. Um, on the other hand, I think that uh, I'm uneasy with the way in which some of these conversations are had, and what I think it means to be an ally. I see a lot of people that I think pretend to be allies, and do so in a performative way, and almost look down on people of other races, like they can't handle a conversation, or they can't handle certain criticisms, and that if you provide any of those things, even if you're well aware of your white privilege or your class privilege, I think you're immediately um, dehumanized, and your intentions are attacked to be something other than what they are. Does that make sense?
So so I'm totally understanding. And I would say the way that, no, it depends. So I want to say, I think I hear your criticism, and I assume you're not saying that this is happening in every single situation. Obviously, but you're saying that this is like the general, like your concern is that this is like the general approach right now.
Yeah, I think there is a general problem with the way in which people talk to each other. Like, I think there are a lot of people who are blind to their own privilege. I think there are also a lot of people that are, almost want to feel outraged, to where there's almost like a knee-jerk reaction without actually trying to understand what's being said. Um, I also think that these conversations are not easy conversations, and I think they're very what's the word I'm looking for, charged conversations, um, and sometimes, like, I guess, let me put it this way. Um, I think there is a place for an ally to just listen, and not necessarily speak, to just hear the experience and the perspective of those that share a different background, socially and otherwise, than you. I also think there is a place where certain issues should be discussed, and discussed openly, even if it's uncomfortable. And one can do that while being aware of one's privilege, I think it's almost necessary to do that, because not doing that, I think, is almost like looking down at people of other backgrounds, as though like they couldn't handle the conversation.
So, yeah, awesome. So the way that I would approach thinking about that, and this is the way that I try to think about things on my page, the way that I got to this thought process is by listening to and being like put in my place a little bit by, like, honestly, the Black women of TikTok, if I want to be honest. Now, there are a number of individuals in particular, for example, because as you're saying, I think one important point I want to highlight at the beginning, that there is a place to discuss these ideas and discuss these things and to educate and have things be open. One example, like, there are groups and places where people can kind of more privately unpack certain issues that affect, that have race-based effects, but that maybe like a white person could kind of unpack the issues and their unique perspective that they're looking at the issue from, and they could have their friends help them, like, calmly and like to like understand what's going on with that. That's really important. And one of the people who does something like that is Desiree B. Stevens on TikTok. And there are lots of other people too as well. But she, for example, really does try to create a space where it's not going to be judgment. You can have those discussions and get that education, so that when you go into that space and ask a question, you're not trying to put labor unnecessarily on someone. You like, that's what the expectation is going in. You're asking these questions and trying to unpack, and the people there are trying to help. The issue comes into play when there are people who are trying to just have a TikTok where they're just sharing their experiences or talking about something, and people come to that page and like expect labor out of that person without compensation, because we know how exhausting like a philosophical discussion with someone can be. As much as we might not all like to put it in this terms as philosophers, because we're all so rational and logical, but philosophical discussions can be exhausting. And if you're not getting paid for that labor, and like it's being forced on you without your consent, that can be a lot. And so I do think that anytime conversations are being shut down, on the one hand, it might be, a lot of the times it's because people are being unreasonable or with their expectations.
Absolutely.
But the other side that's also very valid is, as people are working through their own process of unpacking things, we as and I want to put we as white people, and I don't say that in a pejorative way, like I'm in this group, we as white people, we might, as we're unpacking things and trying to heal, we might inadvertently put some of that on each other, and not respond to each other in the ideal way as as we're trying to grow. And I think a lot of the times that is what the issue is. That is where the shutting down of the conversation comes into play, where it's like where you're saying people just kind of throwing around the term bigot and the term racist in this unhelpful way.
Yeah, so I'm right with you as far as what you just said. Like, I think that people's entitlement, I mean, there's two sides of it, right? Like, if any group of people or any individual wants to see a change, well, to some degree, that's going to require educating others to steer them towards that change. But no one owes anybody anything, right? Like, I think people's expectation that the work should be done for them, I think, is ridiculous. I'm also extremely skeptical of TikTok as a platform.
Yeah.
In the sense that I don't think that these are the kind of discussions that can be had in a successful way in 40-character comments and 3-minute videos, which is one of the reasons why I like I was telling you before we went on, I'm fairly uncomfortable with that app, because I don't really, think that is a particularly useful platform for an in-depth conversation about these topics. And so I think there's, like I said, I think there's a place to speak and there's a place to listen. I think what concerns me sometimes, and as I was listening to you speak, I was reminded of this thing that happened to me where I was in one of my classes for philosophy, and a professor was a black professor, and I loved the class, and I thought, I was really learning a lot, and a lot of what we were doing was looking at questions of existentialism, but also from the perspective of race relations and the way in which uh, one's uh, race and class can impact one's ideas about existentialism and even one's phenomenology. Um, but I was concerned with the way in which some of the dialogue was being had in the classroom, even from the professor themselves, because what they were seemingly suggesting is that um, racial relations in this country have not in any way improved. They've only changed forms. And I think that's actually true to a degree. Um, I'm not, I'm one of those people that is very aware of my own privilege. One of those people that is very aware of the fact that there is still extreme forms of racism in this country. I think the way in which, for example, prisons are run, to me, seems like a modern day slavery in many regards. But at the same time, here is a black professor teaching a classroom of half black students, half white students, and I think probably of people of other backgrounds as well, but mostly black and white, um, saying how nothing has changed. When, 50, 60 years ago, they would not have been in that position to even be allowed on the same premises. And so to me, it feels almost like they're, it, it was bothering me because it felt like people gave their lives so that things would be at least somewhat better. Uh, People gave their lives in the civil rights movement so that there would be some steering towards a change. And while that change is slow, and where in some ways that change hasn't happened, in some ways it has. And I felt like, their own privilege in this context wasn't kind of being examined as being a young uh, black professor in this context. Does that make sense?
I guess I feel like, okay, I'm going to be honest, so I have to be frank. I don't think it makes sense rationally. I think emotionally it makes sense. And I'm
Sure.
really, and here's why. From a rational perspective, to me, if I phenomenologically try to put myself into the position of the professor, I understand that maybe from the perspective of like the white person who is looking at the classroom and thinking like this classroom would have been like all white not that long ago, and now there are like black bodies in this room existing like alongside the white bodies. The perspective from the black person's point of view might not really be that might not be the standard for change, especially because, as you said, so the prison system is an example of kind of like a modern day version of slavery, and the issue being the individuals who find themselves in those systems aren't able to get themselves out of the system.
Sure.
So that once you slip into that system, you're kind of stuck there. And
Right.
the individuals who are more likely to be there, any wrong mistake you could make, something as simple as think back to, and again, so I know you're saying you're not much on the TikTok scene. I don't know if the people who listen to your podcast are, but a big issue that even made the news was the situation of Chelsea, the TikToker, like crying on TikTok.
Yeah.
And everybody immediately like, listen, that's what we're talking about when we're saying all it takes is regardless of what work she had done in the past, she cries. And then like the tendency is for us to perceive that that's a white femme crying. She needs to be protected. We need to protect her. She likely is a victim of this case. And then that could ultimately get somebody killed, where luckily that's not the situation that was happening. But, you have to really think about in the past. And so as the professor of that situation, it's like, do you feel any more like you're any more safe in the environment that you're in than the generation before you? Do you feel any safer? And I'm not trying to say, what I'm definitely not trying to say is that I just think I guess this is what I'll say. We as white people don't know the answer to that question. It's not, we cannot answer it no matter what. So any reaction we have is coming from a place of like, just, we don't know what it's like to be a Black person living and being a professor of students right now. There were professors who were Black in England before there was slavery, so it's not completely genuine to kind of just pretend like in this isolated case, objectively the situation is better or safer.
Right. So I wanna touch upon what you just said, because I think that's a really important point. I agree with everything you just said. The way in which I analyzed that situation wasn't from my own experience, which is the key issue here, because I actually used to think a lot more the other way around, where I didn't think that things had actually changed at all. And then I was a substitute teacher at almost an entirely Black school, and I lived in a neighborhood of almost entirely Black people. And I would converse with them. A lot of my views about about, how would I say this, the evolution, probably not the right word, but how would I say this? My views on race relations in this country, from now compared to what they were, has come from what other Black people have told me are their views. And so I understand why you said everything you just said, and I actually agree with everything you just said. I can't know as a white person what it's like as a Black person to live in this country. And what I was saying wasn't about subjective experience. What I was talking about was more in relations to historically, have things changed, and if they have, on what levels. And the ways in which I think things have changed hasn't come from my own experience projected onto the world, because I know that I have no access to their experience. So my experience will be pointless in this conversation. It's come from actually sitting down with Black people and talking to them about and usually older Black people, and talking to them about what it is that they feel about current race relations in contrast to what those relations used to be, and where there's still work to be done, where things haven't changed, where things have changed. So my perspective wasn't a white perspective. It was more expressing the Black perspective that had been bestowed upon me and had shaped my views. Does that make sense?
So, but that is one thing that I work on my page. I'm trying to help, because so this is a mistake that I think that we as white people make, and I've made this mistake before. So I'm not at all pretending like I haven't done this, but
sure.
It's really not our place to, and here's why. I hear what you're saying, that you're like, listen, I'm not sharing the white perspective. I'm sharing the Black perspective because a Black person, and many Black people, even let's say you got a large number of Black people to share their opinion with you. And then you're arguing that you're like just relaying that.
Yeah.
arguably, and I think that this is very common. I mean, Wittgenstein, right? Like, I mean, like there's lots of pieces of Wittgenstein that might make us like think about this in terms like you deciding when a black person, or like let's say 100 black people tell you their opinion on an issue, and then you as a white person are saying like, okay, and I'm just relaying that. You are making decisions with every single word that you're hearing, every single sentence. You're making decisions about what you hear from each of those individuals, how you're deciding to interpret what it is that they are conveying to you. And then you are deciding how you're going to convey that to others. And you as a white individual, like it's impossible to say that you are able to serve as a middleman for for black opinion and black voices. That's why the best approach is for us to instead focus on communicating with other white people about issues that are affecting white people and that are causing issues for us, because like what the black community says time and time again to us that we might not kind of like hear is like, we could focus on the things that white supremacy does to us. It's not like anybody's trying to say that we are benefiting only from the systems that are here. It's not like anybody's trying to say that we aren't also experiencing different types of oppression, because remember, there are many different pillars of white supremacy, and and we might be victims of any number of those. And so instead of us focusing on trying to communicate for black people or about black people or to black people, we can just communicate to each other about white issues and try and like fix things amongst our community. And if, for example, like you're saying, if there would be people who would object with that professor and say, hey, listen, this isn't, like this isn't the way I would agree. It might be that like, there 49% of black people would agree with him and like 51% of black people would disagree. But at the end of the day, what we as white people can do is like leave that discussion and that debate for them to discuss. And like, again, as you said, not that you never get to discuss, but that the space that you might share your thoughts in would be a much more private space than even a podcast, I would say.
So I understand what you're saying. And to some degree, I agree with the idea that obviously when it comes to language, you mentioned Wittgenstein, right? There is a space or a gap between what somebody is either writing or saying and how we, from our own perspective and our own privilege and our own backgrounds, might be interpreting those words. And I think there's an ambiguity to language that can lead to potentially misinterpretations or mistakes in that way. Mm-hmm. I do think that the context matters, and like the specific ideas that were expressed matters. And I think sometimes the room for error in misinterpreting is lesser than others. I agree with you that there is a time and a place to have certain kind of conversations. Like, I wouldn't go to, what would be agreed upon as a safe space, right, and interject my interpretations and step over a conversation that's being had by that community that hasn't welcomed me into that conversation. I would never do something like that. And like you were mentioning earlier about TikTok, I wouldn't go on a Black creator's page and have any kind of expectations or entitlement, or throw my 2 cents where it may not be necessarily welcome. So I'm with you as far as that. I do think that in the context of a classroom, however, that is a little bit different. Because I think if there is any place to have those conversations from all perspectives and all interpretations, is the classroom. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think for me, that is the place to do it, not anywhere else. Maybe a podcast. where
So I agree with you that a classroom would definitely be an appropriate place, especially because students it's usually a confidential space. Like I would never, for example, like in my opinion, when you're in a classroom setting, you have a contract between student professor, it goes both directions, where you're agreeing that that space is going to be a safe space for everybody to learn. And any type of recordings, there have to be like signed agreements and things like that. So I think that's like legally like a confidential space. But I also think though that that's a safe space for a professor, like a qualified professor, to kind of share like what their conclusion or their like experience, their perspective on that is going to be, what is kind of
yeah. I guess I agree with that, but I guess what I'm saying is that I look at classrooms as the space for the exchange of ideas, whether right or wrong. And so I don't think of classrooms necessarily as a safe space in the same way that I would think maybe certain community events or certain platforms would be. It's
yeah.
more like I think that it would almost be in a sense its own racism of low expectations. If I thought I'm not going to share this information because they might not be able to handle it, like that almost feels dismissive in its own way.
But but so what do you, so are we still talking about like this specific example of like the professor, or are you kind of saying more generally?
No, because what I was saying, I wasn't dismissing the experience of the individual professor. I
Uh-huh.
was saying that there's a difference between talking about one's own subjective experience of what it's like to be a black person in this country
Mm-hmm.
and making a historical claim about whether or not, as a whole and systematically, how things may or may not have changed in total. So
Really?
maybe
You think?
I'm sorry. There's what?
I would want to understand that better, but I don't know if so. To me, I guess I would say, depending on the class, and maybe I'm not understanding because I'm not understanding like what like the type of class would be. But most of the time, if you're thinking of somebody who is like a qualified professor, I think that it is reasonable in like a space like that for a professor to kind of make a historical claim. And then I most definitely think that that's a space, like the issue would be if the professor doesn't allow discussion about that or clarification. And now I do, with the caveat of obviously a student can never expect to be able to take like 30 minutes of a class to debate one claim,
Of course,
but there's
of course,
always
of course.
office hours and things like that, where if the student is like, listen, I really need to understand because it just like, I worry that you're making a false claim. But I don't know. I guess I could even say, I guess I don't take it as like as problematic in that way. So I would want to understand for
Yeah.
you.
So let me clarify. I don't think it was problematic for the professor to share her viewpoint. I think that's what she should do.
Mm-hmm.
But I found what I'm saying is that in the context of a classroom, that viewpoint should be discussed, and any view, whether it's mine or anybody else's, is open to challenge. And
Uh-huh.
and because specifically of the kind of environment that a classroom, in my opinion, is, which is the exchange of ideas and the challenging of ideas. I think that is the proper place to have those conversations.
Yeah. So absolutely. Yeah. And you felt like it wasn't like the space that was kind of cultivated for there. It wasn't
Yes,
such that it was like open to challenge.
yeah, and not usually, but in some, usually it was pretty open, but there were certain contexts in which, understandably so, it was more difficult to have those conversations because these conversations are very emotionally charged, as they should be. And so, to me, it's like, I guess it's finding the balance between how to be an ally without either overstepping somebody's safe space to express their experience, but also respecting their individual enough to have the conversation, to not, dismiss their capacity to engage in the conversation out of some, I think, misguided, almost paternalistic, like, white perspective. You get what I'm saying?
One thing I know is the like in modern discussions, like modern, you got to be careful how you use these words. In not a modern discussion, Kant was not discussing this. In a contemporary and very recent discussions this year, the term ally, it's been pointed out that the term ally isn't really even a good term to kind of put into play.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, right, the term, what we're really focusing on, what everybody needs to focus on, and this is something that I think is true for everyone. Everyone needs to focus on the ways in which they as individuals can make like the community around them a better community for everyone involved. And everyone has a different role. Everybody has different skills that will equip them better for certain things, for example. And it'll never be the case that like everybody, that, there aren't, that you or I shouldn't kind of discuss certain issues, certain philosophical issues that we might think of for the wise. But I do think, the way, by what I was saying earlier, by compartmentalizing certain conversations and saying, there are certain conversations that just aren't for me, like, or at least there's certain approaches to conversations that aren't for me, because like there are more important issues for me to think about, or there are different directions for me to approach the question from, where I can assign blame in a more objective way, or maybe where I can avoid assigning blame at all. I think something you would be really sympathetic to is like the fact that things can be really pejorative, and it's not really helpful. Being pejorative in a lot of these cases is not helpful when people are trying to learn and understand.
Right.
And that's something that comes from a lot of like colonization, like this tendency for this pejorative type of approach is something that like we could kind of take accountability for as like white people, and try to think of what would better approaches be, like that are more effective ethically, are more helpful, that we like better, instead of just, as Socrates would say, instead of perpetuating those traditions of your society without examining them,
Yeah,
like
sure.
living that examined life and looking at, okay, this is like, we always do this. This has been a habit and a tradition for us, but what are the ways in which I even am harmed by this tradition? And what are ways that I could adjust it so that it's better? You don't have to instead be like, what is it that Black people are like? How are they suffering from this tradition? They're like, listen, Black people can decide for themselves. You know what I mean? But
Sure.
we also suffer at the system, even
Absolutely.
academically. Even in the cases of academically, think about, I'm sure you experienced going through grad school, certain incredibly frustrating like traditions and habits of the academic
it's
setting,
horrible.
that it's like, why are these even here? And it's totally valid for that to be a focus that we would take. We don't all have to be out here
Yeah.
doing
academia is a nightmare in many regards. Sure.
Yes, exactly. It really truly is in a lot of cases. Like the I don't know what the term would be, like the dungeons of academia are truly dark.
Yeah. I could tell you horror stories. I'm sure you have them as well. No, I get what you're saying. I think, more or less, I think I'm in agreement with you, outside of maybe a couple of things there. We'll have to agree to disagree, but I see your perspective, sure. I do want to shifting gears slightly, and kind of on a more broad and more general sense. Um, what would you say to somebody who doesn't really have much experience with philosophy? How would you express what you think the value of engaging in philosophy is?
Absolutely. Okay. So to me, philosophy is not just a field of study. It really is like your way of life. Like
Yeah.
you're like your way of life is philosophy. Now I know that sounds corny, but it to me is true. So studying philosophy is having experts in that area, even if you're reading a book and the expert isn't alive anymore, guiding you and kind of mentoring you and thinking about, how could I think about this idea that I think I understand really well? How could I think about it a little bit in a more nuanced way to challenge what I think I know? And doing that in any area of your life really is, to me, philosophy.
Yeah.
So, like you don't have to do it at the highest academic level, but any area that's important, like even if you're an engineer, like there are philosophical questions that I think would be interesting and would apply. And that and especially even in your household, thinking about like, are philosophical differences what underlie like disagreements in your household, and sometimes like putting things even like that into perspective of philosophy can make communicating with people like that you live with even better. So to
Sure.
me, philosophy just improves everything. Studying philosophy makes everything better, in a way that no other field can claim.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say are some philosophers that have been influential in your experience of life, that have changed the way that you look at the world?
So definitely Spinoza, hands down. Spinoza and Kant, I would say. Um, Kant, I was going to say we didn't get to talk about it this time, but like, deconstructing a lot of like religious indoctrination and things like that is its own discussion, and philosophy is really
Sure.
interesting for that process. Um, uh, Daniel Dennett as kind of like a foil for a lot of my beliefs. You had mentioned Daniel Dennett when we talked before, but then also David Velleman. If you've ever read any David Velleman, he's very specifically talks about like nature of self stuff that I'm super into. He talks about like if the self is fundamentally like a locus of control, and so you know what I mean. And that's particularly interesting to me because I'm like, okay, well, a brain is a loci of control. I don't think I, as a self, am identical to my brain. And then think about people with dissociative identity disorder. They would arguably have many loci of control, and their brain's a loci of control. So those questions for me all came out of reading Daniel Dennett, and who actually wrote a paper in response to, David Velleman, who wrote a paper in response to Daniel Dennett. So that conversation, I think, really opened up my mind to important issues that I like to think about. Diana Teachin Myers, also her use of the term psychocorporeal as a type of existence for selfhood. She's somebody that I've actually gotten to speak to in person. So
That's awesome. Could,
I
could
like
you
her philosophy
could
as
you
well.
send me the last two names you just mentioned in the paper that you just referred to? Because I would love to
Yes, I
read
could
it.
actually probably send you copies of the papers as well.
That'd be awesome. That'd be really great. Thank you. I'm definitely interested in learning more about philosophy of the self and different views, psychological and otherwise.
It
I
is
think that
so interesting,
for sure.
especially because you love philosophy of mind, and then naturally it touches on that personal identity, what makes you the same over time, which is, those are the type of metaphysical questions that, bring in the fission cases and parfit and all of that. I love all of that.
I don't know how familiar you are with Merleau-Ponty.
Who?
Merleau-Ponty.
Okay, the name, like, I've heard that name before, but it's not like a philosophical view isn't coming to
Yeah,
mind for me.
he's a he was a French phenomenologist, and he dealt a lot with looking at people with brain damage to see how their subjective experience of the world was dramatically altered once having had, this brain damage from one accident or another or whatever. And he came up with some really interesting ideas. I think at some point on this channel, I'm going to do like a little mini series looking into some of his philosophy. I think that would be fun.
Very, very interesting. Yeah. Like, yes. Okay. I probably will ask you to message me the name too. So I
For
can.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. I agree with what you said. I think philosophy isn't just, theoretical. It's a way of life. And a lot of things, there have been things that I've read that have, to such a fundamental level, shifted my experience of my reality, shifted the way in which I used to think about things.
Yeah.
I'm a far less anxious person than I used to be, because of, for example, reading, and how do I say this? How familiar are you with Nietzsche, for example?
Not very familiar. I mean, I know of Nietzsche, but I don't really dig it. I
There's
didn't
much
dig
that
into anything after Kant very much. I feel like for in terms of ethics,
there
like
is
more
much,
modern.
especially especially in terms of ethics. I disagree with Nietzsche, on a lot of different fronts. But he has this concept of the eternal return, which again I think I'll also go into more detail at some point in the future in the channel. We're asking us to imagine. In fact, let me see if I can even find the quote here, because I think it's really interesting. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. Give me 1 second. Trying to find it on my phone. Okay, I think this is it. I'm trying to find the full quotes here. But wait, if you guys have any questions in the audience that you want to ask, feel free to ask it. Okay, so
I didn't know that there was a comment section.
Yeah. Let's see. Have you also read any of Simone de Beauvoir?
Okay, so I have her The Second Sex. I have that book on my shelf behind me.
I love Simone de Beauvoir so much.
I haven't dug into her the way I have some other philosophers, but yeah, I've at least I'm familiar with her and some of her views.
I think she's phenomenal, and I think she's very underrated. I think she's a much better read than Sartre ever was.
Yes, I have taught a class so many times on Sartre, and there's always a piece from Beauvoir that we do. But yes, I know what you mean.
Okay, I found the quote, and I think I've read this on the channel before, but it's one of my, as much as I don't like Nietzsche in a lot of ways, he has this quote that I think really speaks to me and really changed my life. And I want to read it to you, and I want to hear what you think of it. He writes the following. He says, "What if someday or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and in innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy, and every thought and sigh, and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. even the spider in this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment, and I myself, the eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? Um,
So yeah, so
and I,
what is that like? What's the significance for you?
to me, it is the epitome of embracing life. Like we have this
Hmm.
choice of kind of falling into this life denying spiral, or embracing life for all of its suffering and all of its moments, great or small. um, it's it's a sense of really affirming life in its totality, that I find really uh, empowering in a way. Whereas to some people, they might think of this idea of the eternal um, return or the eternal recurrence, and be disturbed or feel trapped, or be disturbed by it. Um, the way that I experience it is almost like I think it's a beautiful thing, where it's, you know we have this kind of this choice between embracing life or rejecting life, and this idea
Yeah.
of choosing life over and over again. Ultimately, when brought to that moment, to having that question in front of us, how do we react? And I think it says a lot about one's psychology when faced that question, how one chooses to react to that.
Yeah.
So
That's awesome.
yeah, I love that quote. But anyway, yeah, I just wanted to share that with you, to the audience. I think we are. Was there anything else that you wanted to address before we
I
sign?
felt like that was like a perfect blend of like the way that we kind of like touched on all the questions without it being this boring like
Yeah,
moving from one question to another. I really liked the way kind of everything was integrated. So,
yeah. Well,
and
hey,
thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everybody for listening.
yeah, and thank you so much for joining us. I really like what you do on TikTok, and I like your perspective, and I hope you'll come back at some point. Um,
Absolutely.
and please send me those articles, or this, and I'll send you some as well. And definitely keep in touch. I think you're doing a lot of good work there. So
Perfect. Thank you so much. And again, I can't believe that you've been doing a podcast for a year. I think a podcast is a lot more difficult to do than TikTok. That's one of the reasons why I like doing the TikTok. It's very
for me, it's the other way around. It feels so much easier because I have time to uh, get my ideas across. I'm not a very fast stalker. I need time to kind of unpack all these things. I don't deal well with like time pressures. So I'm
uh
trying to get more used to TikTok. By the way, if you want to plug your account, feel free.
oh okay, I guess so. It's Danny California. There's an underscore between there's an underscore at the end, and then like the A in California, there's two of them.
Right.
Um, I'm not really a big on plugging, but yeah, if
Yeah.
you guys want to head over there, it's really just me like doing my own thing there. I do not do TikTok. That was one thing I did want to say to you. I do not do TikTok like a TikToker. It's a philosophy page. I have discussions and I use the videos because like you said, so for me, I have ADHD and I lose my focus very quickly.
Yeah.
So I can have a conversation with you over the course of the day and do 100 other things at the same time and in between. So TikTok really allows me to do that. But it does mean if you follow me on there, I'm not going to be providing you with like an entertaining video every single time I come up on your page.
Sure. Oh, and I'm the same way. Like I don't, especially with my delivery, I don't know how to like animate myself, and a lot of accounts that I see have great content, but they're like, you know, much more engaging in almost like a character way, or a performative way.
Yes.
I'm capable. I have no idea how to do that. I'm just I just sit in front of the camera and try to talk some philosophy, respond to some comments.
Exactly. And you should never feel like you have to. The people who find you and your message gets to them, that's who you're meant to get to. And like, you don't want to at all change. I think anyway, that's how I run my page.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. And hey, thanks again so much for joining us. And I'd love to have you back at some point.
Absolutely. I'll be in touch.
Yeah,
Have a
thank
great
you.
night.
You too. Thanks. And
Bye.
good night, everyone. Thank you for coming on and spending time with us. And I'll be back with another show, I think Friday. And then we have some other things scheduled for the next few weeks. Definitely be getting more guests on. And also next time that come back and we'll go over some of our experiences at the atheist convention and what that was like. So with that said, I hope everybody has a safe night, and I will see you guys all again very soon.